Robert Allan Fratta was once seen as a respected man. A public safety officer. A father. A husband. But behind the neatly trimmed uniform and suburban smile was a chilling truth. In November of 1994, his wife, Farah Fratta, pulled into her garage after dropping off their 3 young children. Moments later, neighbors heard 2 sharp cracks in the night. By the time anyone reached her, she was gone, shot twice in the head. The killer had vanished. But whispers in the community pointed to one man. The one who should have protected her, her own husband. What followed was not just a murder investigation, it was a decades-long descent into betrayal, manipulation, and justice delayed. Robert Fratta's fingerprints were never on the trigger. But his words, his money, and his cold determination were everywhere. And nearly 30 years later, the state of Texas made sure he paid the ultimate price. This is the story of Robert Allan Fratta, the husband who hired killers to end his wife's life. And the man who thought he could escape justice forever. But how does a husband, someone sworn to protect life, turn into the architect of his own wife's death? Why did it take nearly 3 decades for the state of Texas to finally carry out his execution? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what did Robert Fratta say, and do, in his very last moments alive? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is not just the story of a murder. It is a story of betrayal, manipulation, and justice that refused to die. To understand Robert Fratta's descent into darkness, we need to go back. On the surface, he was the picture of suburban respectability, living in Atascocita, Texas, with his wife, Farah, and their 3 children. But behind closed doors, their marriage was unraveling. Farah described him as controlling, abusive, obsessed with appearances. Friends would later testify that she lived in fear of him. The divorce was bitter, the custody battles even worse. To Robert, Farah wasn't just his estranged wife, she was his enemy. And in his mind, there was only one solution: she had to be erased. Robert Fratta didn't just fantasize about killing Farah. He spoke openly to acquaintances, saying he wanted her dead. Over and over, his words painted a chilling picture. He didn't want blood on his own hands. He wanted someone else to do it. And in late 1994, he finally found men willing to take his money and pull the trigger. The plan was simple, cold, efficient. Farah would be ambushed in her garage. Their children would be inside the house, just a few steps away. November 9, 1994. Farah dropped her children off at church, then drove home. At 7 p.m., as she pulled into her garage, a gunman stepped from the shadows. 2 shots rang out. Farah collapsed before she could even scream. Her 3 children, just 6, 8, and 9 years old, were inside the house. They would be the first to find out their mother was never coming back. Neighbors rushed to the sound. Police soon swarmed the quiet street. At first, no one could prove who pulled the trigger. But suspicion, strong, unrelenting suspicion, pointed immediately to Robert Fratta. When detectives arrived at the Fratta home, they quickly realized this was no random act of violence. Farah had been targeted. Shot at close range. Ambushed in the one place she should have felt safe. From the very beginning, suspicion turned toward her estranged husband, Robert Fratta. Neighbors and friends told police about the bitter divorce, about his controlling behavior, about the constant threats. It wasn't long before detectives began to hear the same chilling story over and over again. Robert had been openly talking about wanting his wife dead. But wanting someone dead, and proving it in court, are 2 very different things. Robert was careful. He had no gunpowder on his hands, no blood on his clothes. He wasn't at the scene. Someone else had pulled the trigger. Investigators dug deeper. Through interviews, phone records, and witness statements, a network of accomplices emerged. A middleman. A getaway driver. And the man who fired the shots. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Testimony from acquaintances revealed that Robert had repeatedly asked around, who would kill Farah for him. He had even discussed paying thousands to make her disappear. Those words became his undoing. By 1996, the case went to trial. In the courtroom, Robert sat expressionless as prosecutors painted him not as a grieving husband, but as a calculating manipulator who viewed murder as a solution to his custody battle. Witnesses took the stand. Friends, co-workers, even acquaintances testified that Robert had spoken openly of his desire to see Farah gone. One after another, they described his cold, casual remarks that revealed a man obsessed with control, willing to use money and manipulation to get what he wanted. The jury deliberated. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty of orchestrating the murder of his wife. Robert Fratta was sentenced to death. But as the gavel fell and the sentence was read, the story was far from over. For Robert, the courtroom defeat was only the beginning of a decades-long fight against his fate. In 1996, Robert Fratta was sentenced to death for orchestrating the murder of his wife, Farah. But in America's justice system, a death sentence does not always mean swift justice. Almost immediately, Robert began filing appeals. His lawyers argued that much of the case against him relied on hearsay, statements from acquaintances repeating what he had said. In 2009, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals actually overturned his conviction, ruling that key testimony had been improperly admitted. For a moment, it seemed Robert might escape death row. But prosecutors refused to let the case die. They retried him, using the same witnesses, the same mountain of circumstantial evidence, and the same narrative. Robert had wanted his wife dead, and he had paid to make it happen. Once again, the jury returned the same verdict: guilty. And once again, Robert was sentenced to death. The years dragged on. Appeal after appeal. Motion after motion. Robert claimed he was innocent. He claimed the evidence was unreliable. He claimed the state had failed him. But with every petition denied, the walls around him closed in. Behind bars, Robert Fratta developed a reputation. Inmates and prison staff described him as cold, calculating, and still obsessed with control. He denied responsibility, portraying himself as the victim of a corrupt system. Meanwhile, Farah's family, especially her children, were forced to wait. They grew up without their mother. They carried the trauma of that November night into adulthood. And still, year after year, the man responsible for her death continued to fight for his life. For nearly 3 decades, the case of Robert Fratta wound its way through the courts. Justice was delayed, but not forgotten. By late 2022, after exhausting his final appeals, the state of Texas set a date. Robert Allan Fratta would be executed on January 10, 2023. By late 2022, Robert Fratta had run out of time. His appeals had been exhausted. The United States Supreme Court refused to intervene. And the state of Texas circled a date on the calendar: January 10, 2023. For nearly 3 decades, Robert had managed to delay his fate. But now, the countdown had begun. In his final weeks, prison officials moved him into what's known as Death Watch. A small cell, isolated from the general population, where every move is monitored. Here, he would spend his last days alive. Farah's family, after 30 years of waiting, braced themselves for closure. Some prayed for peace. Others wrestled with anger that it had taken so long. But one thing was certain: justice, long delayed, was finally at hand. As the execution date drew closer, Robert continued to claim innocence. He argued that he had been framed, that others were responsible for Farah's death. But the courts were unmoved. The evidence was clear. And the sentence was final. On January 10, 2023, as the sun rose over Huntsville, Texas, preparations for the execution began. Robert was offered a final meal, though records show he declined to order anything special. He was given the chance to write a last statement. Hours later, he was escorted into the execution chamber, a sterile room, with pale green walls and a single gurney bolted to the floor. Witnesses filed in, journalists, officials, and members of Farah's family. For them, this moment was the end of a nightmare that had lasted 3 decades. Strapped to the gurney, Robert remained emotionless. He looked straight ahead. When asked for his final words, he said nothing. No apology. No confession. No expression of remorse. At 7:49 p.m., the lethal injection began. Minutes later, Robert Allan Fratta was pronounced dead at the age of 65. For the first time since November 1994, Farah's family could finally breathe. Justice had come, not swiftly, but surely. Robert Allan Fratta lived nearly 30 years after orchestrating his wife's murder. But in the end, the truth could not be outrun. Farah's life was stolen in an instant, shot down in her own garage, her children left without a mother. And yet, for decades, the man responsible continued to breathe, fight, and deny. His silence in those final moments spoke volumes. No remorse. No apology. No acknowledgement of the pain he caused. For some, that silence is the cruelest truth of all. Farah's children grew up in the shadow of this crime. Their lives forever split into before and after. And while Robert's execution brought a measure of justice, nothing could restore what was lost. As the prison gates closed on January 10, 2023, one story ended. But the questions remain. What drives a person to turn their own family into targets? How many more live behind masks of normalcy, hiding darkness beneath? And most chilling of all, if love and trust can twist into betrayal and murder, how well can we ever truly know the people closest to us? Tell me what you think. Did Robert deserve the death penalty, or should life in prison have been enough? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story haunted you, share it with someone who thinks evil always looks obvious. Sometimes, it hides in plain sight. Don't forget to subscribe, because next time, we'll dive into another chilling case, one where the truth is even darker than the crime itself. Until then, stay safe, and stay curious.